welcome to Critical Issues, Alternative Views. I'm Ron Kramer from the Department of Sociology at Western Michigan University, and I'll be the host for today's program. With me, as always, is my ideological sidekick, Don Cooney. Don is a professor in the School of Social Work at Western Michigan University, and he also is a Kalamazoo City Commissioner. We have two very special guests with us today. First of all, on my right, I'd like to introduce Shadia Kanan, who is a member of Kalamazoo Nonviolent Opponents of War, the Kalamazoo Interfaith Coalition for Peace and Justice, and also a member of Women in Black. And Shadia, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
And we also have with us Noor Habash, who is a student in a Quaker school in the West Bank. She's originally from Gaza, but she now lives in Ramallah. And you're going into the 8th grade, is that right, Noor? Okay. So welcome to the program. On this program, we try to address critical issues, and certainly there's no more critical issue right now than the Israeli-Palestinian situation and the current assault that's taking place on Gaza. And with every critical issue that we look at, we try to present an alternative perspective, something that you don't get in the mainstream media. And I think it's fair to say that there's an extreme bias on the part of both the United States government as well as the mainstream media in the United States against the Palestinian position. We do not ever get much of a chance to hear the Palestinian perspective. And so we're hoping that that will be provided today with our two guests. So the critical issue is the assault on Gaza, and we're hoping to present a Palestinian perspective on that. So, Shadia, let me turn to you first of all. We've had all kinds of flare-ups in Israel and Palestine in any number of years now. What's caused this latest flare-up? What's going on that's led to the current round of fighting, the current assault that's taking place on Gaza?
Okay, I think the problem with our media and our public is we always have a soundbite and we follow the latest events. We never go actually and put it in the context, in its proper context, political and historic. In this case, the real cause is the occupation, the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza since 1967. And the Palestinians trying through different channels, international legitimacy, peace initiatives, to gain their right to statehood and self-determination and ending the occupation. So any flare-up or any confrontation militarily between the two parties, Israel and few resistant factions in the West Bank, is always oppressed, with unproportional Israeli military power against the people. The last flare-up has its own context, which is actually a little more serious than the previous ones. The last flare-up has to do a lot with the Palestinian unity government that was formed just recently, like in June of this year. Hamas was under a lot of pressure in Gaza because of the blockade of the siege.
So let's back up and
Yes.
just point out. So Hamas is the legitimate representative government in Gaza,
Correct.
the Gaza Strip.
Correct.
But on the West Bank, which there's a physical separation between Gaza and the
Is
West
the
Bank,
Palestinian Authority.
the Palestinian Authority, and
Okay.
Fatah is the primary political party
forming the government and
forming
in
the
charge.
government.
Correct. Now, if we want to go back to how that happened, we can take a step back and talk about how that division happened. If you remember, in 2006, there were elections, free elections, and President Carter's Democratic, they monitored the elections, and they said that it was a very fair and democratic and honest elections that took place at that time. Hamas won by a landslide, and there were many reasons for that, namely the failure of the peace process, the failure after Oslo, and the failure because of the settlement building and the increased colonialization of the West Bank and land confiscations and so on. So the people in the West Bank and Gaza voted overwhelmingly for Hamas because they did a lot of social projects and they were more the honest, the honest party, no corruption. They didn't have corruption in their government, in their organizations. So immediately Israel and the United States boycotted that government and called for the Hamas representation in that government and forming that government illegitimate. And there was a kind of like a coup d'etat, if you want to call it, a rebellion, and there was a fight actually among the Palestinians themselves, which ended up in this separation. Hamas taking hold in Gaza, and the Abbas, the Fatah group, taking hold in the West Bank. And that separation started since 2006. Now, the blockade in Gaza and the fight on Hamas, it's not a fight against Hamas, it's a fight against the Palestinian people, all of them. There is 1.8 million civilians in Gaza. They live under the most crowded conditions. It's the smallest, most condensed population anywhere in the world. And under the blockade, they were short of cleaning drinking water, and the Israelis, for any different reason, we remember the war of 2008, 2009, with cast-lead operation against Gaza. Gaza destroyed all the electric plants, all the salination cleaning plant for the sewage. They restricted Gaza people from fishing in their own water up to a mile, while the sewage ran in the streets and still does, and in the water. And that's the only 1 mile they are allowed to fish for their daily food. Anytime they go beyond that 1 mile, the Israeli gunboats shoot at them and sometimes drowns the boats.
So Gaza has sometimes been called the largest concentration
camp in the world. That's an open prison. Now, the Hamas people, and we always say Hamas, it's not just Hamas. There is many factions in Hamas, in Gaza, fighting with Hamas, organizing with Hamas. And among them are leftists, like the UFLP, the Palestinian Liberation for Palestine, which is a leftist group. They are fighting with Hamas. There is the more extreme Islamist group, which is jihad, Islamic jihad. So it's not Hamas, but we say Hamas because that's what the media always tells us. That started the only way for the people to get their food, their construction material, their daily necessities was through tunnels built through Egypt. And there were hundreds of tunnels that the government, the Hamas government, allowed because they would tax the goods coming through the tunnels, and that's how they paid for their employees, for their system, for their... So those tunnels is what Israel is meant to right now, because they said that's where they also smuggle material to make those weapons and those rockets. So Israel in this war right now are after dismantling and shutting these tunnels, which is the lifeline for the people in Gaza. So going back to why now, we're going back to the unity government. Hamas, under the pressure and under the economic siege and no money, because no bank in the world will accept transfers of money to the people of Gaza. So, and the unity government, Hamas relinquished all its power to this unity government, to Abbas government in the West Bank, for easing the blockade. That did not happen. The blockade is still as intense. The people are still suffering. This last episode, the unity government, our Secretary of State, John Kerry's attempt at a peace resolution and shuttling diplomacy here and there, and almost failed. That Israel wants to disrupt the peace process, which it disrupted every other one. It wanted to disrupt this unity government, and it wanted to continue its policy of colonialization, settlement building, and strangling the population so that they would leave. So it's, in other words, it is a more or less a voluntary transfer of people, because people give up and they leave. So what happened is Netanyahu took advantage. The situation gave him the advantage, the kidnapping of those 3 kids in Hebron, the settlers, the Jewish settlers in Hebron. And he took advantage of that before he knew they were killed. They could have been kidnapped for a prisoner exchange, for example. he went into the West Bank into a rampage of violence. The army was inside the cities, inside homes, searching, stealing. And then he started, the army, the Israeli government started imprisoning every Hamas member and organizer in the West Bank, even those legislative members who were elected to that to council, city councils, or whatever civil government there. That and by itself, and then the burning to death alive of the Palestinian kid, Muhammad Khdair, in Jerusalem. All this caused Hamas, and the attack on its people in Gaza, they started throwing rockets in Gaza. And that was the outbreak. Netanyahu took advantage immediately, and the outbreak of this very vicious, very war that's still going on. This is week 3. And the killing goes unheeded 24 hours from the air, from the sea, and the land. All the Israeli power, military power, is launched on the people of Gaza.
Okay, so let's come back to that in a moment. I want to bring Nora in now. And so I think it's really important that people do understand that it is the illegal occupation that is the broader context. And, you know, people that fight over this issue all the time, history begins at different points for different people depending on their perspective. But I do think that 67 is the important starting point for the current contemporary political situation. It certainly is the point at which the legal issues that we're talking about kick in. After the 1967 war, Israel did seize territory, and under international law, that territory cannot be taken by the occupying country. And some people say, well, they won it in the war, why can't they take it and settle it and so forth? And somebody said, well, the U.S. won World War II, but we didn't, and we occupied Japan, but we didn't keep it, right? Mm-hmm. And international law does forbid keeping the occupied land forever. So 67 is an important starting point. And also in terms of any peace negotiations, often the 67 border, which is called the Green Line, I believe, yes, is almost always the starting point when we talk about a two-state solution and drawing a border between Israel and a Palestinian state. So I think the 67 point is important, but it also is the beginning of an illegal occupation, illegal under international law. So let's establish that. Now, Nora, I want to bring you in because I know you've been talking a little bit while you've been here in the U.S. about what your life is like under the occupation. And again, as you said, your father was from Gaza and you lived there for a while, but now you live in the West Bank, so you've had experience in both areas probably, or at least know about the situation in Gaza. So tell us a little bit about just daily life for yourself and for other Palestinians under the occupation.
Well, soldiers aren't in streets anymore in Ramallah, where I live. They're outside when, if, for example, you can't see them when we're going to school, but if we want to leave to go to Nablus or, for example, Jerusalem, we can't. To Nablus, there are checkpoints that you have to go through, which might take a really long time. And to Jerusalem, you have to get a permit, which takes a really long time and might actually be denied. And so you can't visit family. For example, my family's in Gaza. I haven't seen them since 10 years, I think. You need to get a permit. That's really, really hard to get, and I haven't gotten it since 10 years ago. And my father hasn't seen his family also.
You need a permit to go to Jerusalem, which isn't that far from Ramallah, but you also need a permit to go from the West Bank into the Gaza Strip as well. Okay. Go ahead. I'm sorry, I just wanted to make sure that point is clear. So you need the permits are denied, you have to go through checkpoints, even if you want to go other places in the West Bank, right? And just what are some of the other conditions of daily life for the Palestinian people under occupation?
Some people, there's sometimes bombing on checkpoints that can, like, people might die and get injured. And for if you actually want to leave Palestine, to go to Jordan, you have to go through the bridge, which is actually the same process as going to Gaza, but less more complicated. And it takes from 5 to 7 hours.
Really? Wow. It shouldn't take that long to travel. It's a really short distance, right? But it, because of the delays at the checkpoint, which are very deliberate, and so it does make it a very difficult process just moving around, right? Okay. Don?
Yeah, and I'm wondering, like, the settlements, the Israelis moving into the West Bank, keep increasing. Have you seen that where there's more and more settlers moving in and less land for the Palestinians? Have you seen that?
Actually, when you're going from one city to another, when you look at the mountains, they are full of settlements that really are actually turning into small towns and are full of people. There are schools there, like parks, Israelis, and they're everywhere, and they're getting more and more every day.
And my understanding is that to travel around, there are roads which only Israelis can travel on, Palestinians can't travel on. Is that right?
It's correct. When, for example, you want to enter Jerusalem or any area there, you have to have the permit, and if you have a Palestinian ID, you cannot drive there. You need to go to a taxi or the bus, but the Israeli bus, you can't go on it. Only for people who have the Israeli ID. And so I can't go on that, or my family. So we need to take a taxi, or someone from Jerusalem has to come pick us up that has the Israeli ID.
Now, suppose someone needs to go to a hospital, and my understanding is that most of the hospitals are in the Israeli section. Is it difficult to get through the checkpoints to get to hospitals?
Well, there are some hospitals in the West Bank, but the hospitals in Jerusalem, Israel, that part, are actually much better. And so if it was a really bad condition, they would let us in, but you need to go through a really long process. But if it was something that could be treated in Ramallah, they won't let you in.
Okay, right. And what are the conditions as far as schools, as far as the streets being safe, the sanitation, all those things? How is that adequate in the West Bank or not?
Well, in the town itself, it's actually safe to go around. But if you want to leave town or go to areas that aren't, like, people don't really live there, it's kind of dangerous because sometimes you can go to reach to a point where you're in a highway and around you there are settlements who might shoot. If they see you, you might be a threat.
How about schools? Are the schools adequate? Are they well financed, or what about that?
Public schools aren't good at all. They start teaching English from 7th grade, and they're really weak schools that people don't really go to good colleges after it and can't go outside of Palestine to go to good schools. There's only one school that has the International Baccalaureate program, and the others are private schools with other systems.
Okay, okay.
Now we should point out in terms of, again, looking at international law as objectively as possible here. Because of the occupied territory, it is illegal for Israel to continue to occupy that territory. They are not allowed to build the settlements there. The settlements, every single one of them, are illegal under international law. And in fact, the United Nations has declared that those settlements are illegal. And this remains the very enormously contentious issue because there are certain factions in Israel that believe in the notion of a greater Israel, that all of this is Israeli land and that should be occupied. And so there's a very active campaign of building settlements. It's been 14 years since I was there, but even at that point in 2000, I could see, when you would go into the West Bank on the way up to Ramallah, you could see the settlements and, the roads roads that the Palestinians travel on are very bad. The roads that the Israelis travel onto the settlements are very good. And even then, again, passing through the checkpoints, I had many occasions to, in fact, several times we had to get off the highway and drive around checkpoints to get back to Ramallah after we had left Ramallah when I was there. So certainly that's an aspect of daily life in the West Bank. And again, that the settlements are illegal, and this is an enormously contentious issue because the current Israeli government continues the program of building new settlements. And even the United States, I mean, I think U.S. policy is that the settlements, that they should stop building the settlements, but our governments, any number of them in recent years, have been unable to really control this issue. And so there are many Israelis that want to continue to build settlements. It's illegal under international law. U.S. policy is that they should stop doing this, that it's an impediment to the peace process.
Exactly.
But our own government has been unable to do anything about that. And yet we continue to supply massive amounts of economic and financial assistance to the state of Israel while it continues its illegal policy of building these settlements. Right?
In fact, the settlement building is the biggest impediment to peace, to any peace process, because it's facts on the ground. And Israel uses the peace process as a cover to buy time to build more settlements and to confiscate more Palestinian lands. 60% of the land in Palestine, in the West Bank, has been confiscated and taken for settlements. Because the settlements are not just the settlement itself. It's the roads around it and the bypass roads around it, plus the roads that connect them to each other. There are settlements that are 40 and 50,000 people. They have universities there. So how? And that gets us into the solution of the one state or the two states.
Right.
Because how could you have a state, a Palestinian viable state, with those divided Bantustans, those little enclaves that are separated by the Israeli settlements and the bypass roads? I mean, anybody could look at a map on Google and see what the conditions look in the West Bank. It's true that the Israelis pulled out of Gaza in 2005 and dismantled the two settlements around Gaza. But we gave them money, our taxpayer money, to build more settlements in return in the West Bank. And of course, there's the blockade and the siege on Gaza. So Gaza is not free. They didn't really actually end the occupation of Gaza. So if we talk about the resolution, if Israel wants a true peace, I would talk about the Arab Initiative of 2002, which was called the Prince Abdullah Initiative, who is the king now of Saudi Arabia. That initiative was for every Arab country. They signed on it, endorsed it. All Arab countries and all Muslim countries endorsed this initiative, the peace initiative, for complete recognition of the state of Israel. And that negates the myth that the Arabs are all around it, it's the only democracy with all enemies to destroy it. I mean, that actually really proves that the lie of that myth. And then the initiative called Complete Recognition, Complete Normalization of Relationship with ambassador level, economic, commercial, tourism, everything, in return, ending the Israeli occupation, implementing the multiple Security Council and United Nations resolutions calling for Israel to withdraw to the 1967 borders. And that didn't happen. And the peace process is actually, it's an act of deception that Israel follows to build facts on the ground with the settlements. And of course, the wall, we have to touch upon the wall and the humanitarian condition. I mean, if we go to B'Tselem, which is an Israeli human rights group, they talk about what the humanitarian aspect of its effect on the Palestinian people. It's horrendous. So all these conditions and all the condemnation of the world right now, all the demonstrations here and everywhere in Europe and Arab world, is not going to make a dent in Israeli policy until we, as a country, United States, is the only country that has leverage on Israel to actually accept the peace process that our Secretary of State at the end is taking to Israel, and they find loopholes, they find not to accept it, because we have to admit one thing. Israel does not want peace. Israel, maybe it wants peace, but it doesn't want a just peace.
No. And I was very impressed recently by Professor Juan Cole from the University of Michigan had 3 maps
Yes.
about the diminishing amount of land that the Palestinians have. Before 1947, it was all Palestinian.
Yes.
And then when Israel came in and established their state, what percentage of that area was
Given to Israel under the partition plan? 55%.
55%.
45% for the Palestinian people, who were the overwhelming majority, and
Right.
land ownership
Yeah.
in Palestine. Yes.
So that was in 1947, 1948.
Yes.
But today, how much of that 45% do they still have?
Well, the 45% includes Gaza. So whatever is the West Bank is 22%, and 60% of that is settlements. There is 9% left for the Palestinians.
9%.
9%. Now, the West Bank is divided, according to Oslo Accord, to 3 areas, Area A, B, and C. A, and that's why Noor doesn't see soldiers in the street. Area A said that the Palestinian major population centers, the major cities, are complete security and administration to the Palestinian Authority, complete. And that's why the major cities, Ramallah, Nablus, Hebron, are, but not the land in between. That's why we have to go checkpoints from one city to the other. Area B is joint security for both Israel and Palestinian Authority. C is all ownership and administration authority is for Israel. So even that 9% is divided in those ways. And when you have a building you need to build in Area C, you can't. You can't. Here we have to talk about home demolitions and the hundreds of homes that have been demolished because the people added a roof or a room because they couldn't get a permit, a license, and their houses were demolished. And one point I want to make, just show the inhumanity of the Israeli occupation. When a house is deemed to be demolished for a violation, the bill is sent to the owner for demolishing his house, and if he wants to save paying that bill, he demolishes his own home. I mean, this is the ultimate barbarism, the ultimate. And we call it the only democracy in the Middle East.
And so, in terms of the peace process and the notion of a two-state solution, the 1967 border, the green line, is supposed to be the recognized border, but because of the continual buildup of the settlements, facts on the ground, it's making it almost impossible for there to be any kind of two-state solution settlement ultimately, because for that to work, those Israeli settlements would have to be abandoned. I mean, that would be the law, that would be the diplomatic resolution. And there are many, there's some room to maneuver around the green line in terms of the Israeli settlements that were there. There could be some swaps of land to allow some of those settlements, but the settlements that have been built deeper into the West Bank, those would have to be abandoned, and it's very clear that there are factions within Israel, politically powerful factions, including the Likud party, which would never agree to that. So to me it seems like it's an impossibility to construct a peace process as long as there's that commitment to those settlements, and the more of those settlements that are built, the more difficult it is to arrange for any kind of a settlement that will end up with the two-state solution that has been so often discussed over the last 30, 40 years, right?
And the wall that's supposed to be, I mean, the International Court of Justice ruled that if Israel wants to build a wall, it should be on the 1967 border. But the wall actually infringes and zigzags into Palestinian territory. And there are the path of the wall, if it were to be built on the Green Line, is something like 350 miles. Right now it's 600 something, because it goes in and out to engulf or to include those settlements. Now, the Palestinians have offered many compromises, the Palestinian Authority, where they would allow Israel to keep, annex to Israel, the major settlements, the ones that are cities actually. But the smaller ones, the Palestinian Authority offered that they can either leave or live under Palestinian sovereignty, Palestinian rule. And but these offers are all in paper because Israel never actually accepted any peace plan,
I think it's really difficult for people in the United States to understand what it's like to live under occupation. I mean, if they told us, if there was a foreign country who had troops in our land and told us, you cannot go from this state to Chicago without getting a passport from us, and we're not going to give you one anyhow, or if we ever do, it'll take months to get there. How would we feel about that? How would we feel if people moved into our land and put up a wall and said, you are on this side and you're not allowed to come over here, even though that was my land before? How would they feel with so many of our people being in prison for protesting and standing against this occupation? I think when we talk about it, it tends to be almost abstract, but it's in the daily living that I think that where is the self-determination? Where is the ability for people to be themselves? What are your hopes?
I really hope that Palestinian people can be able to return to their lands because Palestinians are not going to just lay back and give up their rights, because they won't do that. They'll keep fighting even though Israel will bomb or keep bombing and shooting. They will never stop fighting, and I really hope things can go back where they were years ago.
I think it's really important to point out that there's an awful lot of research in political science and history that demonstrates that what is called terrorism, resistance, which is sometimes resistance of the less powerful against the powerful, is often labeled as terrorism, right? You can have terrorism on the part of the powerful by states. Obviously, it never gets labeled that, but then any resistance that's generated often gets labeled terrorism. But it's very clear. There's Robert Pape is the political scientist over at the University of Chicago, and he has the largest database on what the suicide bombings as one particular form of what is called terrorism. And his main conclusion after, this is a heavy statistical analysis, what causes suicide bombings, what causes that particular form of resistance and terrorism? The answer that emerges very clearly in his data, it is illegal occupation. Illegal occupation generates that kind of resistance, that kind of violence. It's the single cause, and it doesn't matter what part of the world we're talking about. It could be anywhere in the world, but when we see this form of resistance emerging, it's almost always related to an illegal foreign occupation. And so, yes, this occupation, this illegal occupation, has generated various forms of resistance. And the intifada, there have been several intifadas as they were labeled, right? One of them started the day that I arrived in Israel, by the way. I didn't take responsibility, but the day that I arrived in 2000, in September of 2000, was the day that Ariel Sharon went into Old Jerusalem, went to the Al-Aqsa Mosque, or near the mosque, and
started the second intifada.
Started the second intifada. So that's why the time that I was there was so sort of touch and go. Why, because things really started to heat up. I thought I was going at a time when things were pretty stable, and as it turned out to be a rather unstable time. But that resistance gets generated. Now, again, that resistance can sometimes take forms which many people have moral qualms about, right? Because it often, the fact is that the Hamas right now, lobbing their homemade makeshift bombs into Israel, is targeting Israeli citizens. This is also a war crime under international law. And again, I think those of us that are pacifist deplore the use of violence as a way of resistance. But again, I want to make, well, the larger point I want to make is that the resistance, even if we don't approve of it, and in particular violent forms, is understandable as a reaction to occupation. And then the occupying power responds with an overwhelming amount of force to respond to the resistance. And so,
And that is state terrorism then.
and that is what certainly many people would call state terrorism. And so let's get back to the current situation. So you outlined the immediate situation that led up to the current conflict. And of course, Hamas's response was to once again start launching their homemade makeshift rockets into Israel, which haven't done a whole lot of damage. But nonetheless, they are an instrument of terror, of resistance, and this has caused Israel to respond. Now, the Israeli response, this is where again international law comes back into play, because the Israeli response, in terms of attacking Gaza, has also taken forms which are clearly illegal under international law. You cannot use military force which is indiscriminate, which is disproportionate to any kind of military objective, that deliberately targets civilians. And yet that's exactly what's been happening with the Israeli response. And so, again, I want to make clear that these are war crimes that are being committed now by the Israeli government in its attack on Gaza, because it is. And how many civilians have been killed?
Well, so far around 700, but the injuries have been close to 4,000. I have to add a point here for Israel to claim or to they have to join the international the ICC, the International Criminal Court. And for that, they have to sign on the Rome Convention. And the Palestinian Authority, as the legal authority representing the Palestinians, have to sign on that. They have been actually threatened by the US of cutting off funds if they do join those international organizations that would entitle them to go and charge Israel with war crimes. And they are the only ones they can do that. I mean, nobody can ask, for Israel to be tried unless the Palestinian Authority does that. They have to sign on that. They have to sign on the Rome Convention, and they have been very hesitant to do that because of fear of the cutting of their funds from the United States and the European Union. So that's the first step. Now, going back, what does the resistance in Israel right now? If you remember the prisoner exchange when Shalit, the Israeli soldier, was kidnapped in 2009, the prisoner exchange was 1 for 1,000. He was released. Hamas, 1,000 of, I think, Hamas sympathizers or fighters were. Now, under this outbreak of violence, all of these prisoners were taken back. All the ones that were released in the prisoner exchange are back. And one of Hamas's demands right now is ending of blockade and releasing those prisoners. You know, Hamas and the Palestinian people are not willing to go back to pre-war, to the preconditions, because it's going to be more misery for the people on Gaza. Remember, this is a war on the people of Gaza, not on Hamas or any of the other factions. The humanitarian conditions cannot go back to the way it was. So the blockade, and Israel took advantage of the weakness of the Arab regimes and the lack of support the Palestinians have. We thought after the Arab Spring there will be more revival of the unity behind and the support for the Palestinian cause. Sadly, every Arab country has been having its own internal problems, and Egypt, this last government of Egypt, because they are against the Brotherhood, the Islamic Brotherhood, and Hamas is the Islamic chapter of the Brotherhood. So Egypt, which has the only crossing into Gaza, Rafah crossing, it has closed that and dismantled most of the tunnels that bring those humanitarian food and conditions. So it is a very complicated story. But the end of this, the Hamas is still going on, even with more casualties, and the people supported everywhere. That without lifting the blockade and the prisoners' release, they are not going to accept any ceasefire. The ceasefire that was offered by Egypt did not offer ending the blockade. They said, we will discuss that later. And later is not going to work, because in 2012, it was part of the agreement, and Israel reneged and did not implement the part where the blockade should end. And for the crossings into Israel, not necessarily, open, but the Rafah crossing, which is the only exit for Gaza and its 1.8 million people into the world, and for exports, and they cannot export their goods. Gaza has been completely devastated.
Yeah, I don't think people understand how isolated and hemmed in Gaza is. There's no escape.
No.
There's no, I mean,
Open air prison.
with the Israeli assault, there's nowhere to go. There's no, there aren't, I mean, and in fact, when people are in their homes, those homes can be deemed by the Israeli military as legitimate targets, because they say, well, Hamas is hiding. They're using human shields. They're hiding in certain homes, or they have some of these rockets in those homes, and therefore they're claiming that those are legitimate military targets. They're not. That's illegal under international law to deliberately target civilian homes in that manner. But that's the way in which the Israeli government is attempting to justify and provide some thin veneer of legal legitimacy to some of the assault that they're undertaking. But the larger point is, in terms of international law, that this is a form of collective punishment, which is absolutely prohibited. So even if Hamas is doing things that violate international law, and I think that they are on some occasions as part of their resistance, the Israeli government cannot now punish all of the people of the Gaza Strip because of the actions of some Hamas militants. That is a form of collective punishment. Again, strictly prohibited under international law. So you can't go in and assault everyone in the Gaza Strip, which is essentially what's happening, and claim that this is a legitimate military target. It just doesn't work that way. You can't impose collective punishment on a group of people for the actions of a few people who might be within that particular territory. So I wanted to make that clear from, again, this is just from an objective international law perspective. Amnesty International, any human rights organization, the United Nations, all would declare that this is a violation of the Geneva Convention, Fourth Geneva Convention of 1949, to impose collective punishment on a population like Israel is doing right now.
And the way that's carried out, the indiscriminate nature of the killing. I mean, the number of children that have been killed, and some of the stories that have come out about children being beheaded, children cut in half, so that a father trying to get his child has to go to 2 different hospitals because his child was cut in half. I mean, it just cuts you to your heart.
The entire buildings have been demolished with F-16 with people inside, entire families, and they are hitting ambulances, so the ambulances cannot get to them. Hospitals, schools, humanitarian, everything. But my point, to go back to the issue, is what is the solution if United States continues to play the dishonest broker in this conflict? I mean, this is the only country that has leverage to tell Israel, stop. And we're not doing this because we all know the power of the Israeli lobby, the AIPAC. And I hope everybody would read the book, The Lobby, by Mersheimer and Bolt, which says that the hold that the Israeli lobby has on our government and on Congress is detriment to the United States interests in the region and in the world. So we have to really write to our representatives and our government to be the honest broker in this conflict.
Yeah, I mean, I am so angry about the response of our president and our Senate, who justify what Israel is doing, give them a pass, saying, well, they have to defend themselves, without any kind of consideration of the proportion, of the indiscriminate nature of the killing, of the whole context, the historical context that you have presented so well. It is very disappointing. And, you know, we can all contact them. I mean, I know I've called the offices of our senators, of our congressmen, of the president, and everyone needs to do that. I have been impressed that a number of Jewish people in this country are speaking out. And yesterday, there was in New York, there was a group of Jewish people that went to an organization that supports the Israeli Defense Organization and occupied their building and spoke out and said, as Jewish people, we say, not in our name. I was impressed with Gideon Levy, the Israeli writer for Haaretz, one of the probably the major Israeli newspaper, who said, this is inhumane, it's a violation of international law, and it's stupid. It will never bring us any closer to peace. So, and there have been demonstrations among the Israeli Jewish people who are saying, we don't want this in our name, we want this to stop. But they've been attacked. Some of those people have been attacked, and Gideon Levy said that now he has been forced to accept a bodyguard when he walks around the streets. So much for the great democracy and freedom of speech that the Israelis proclaim they are.
Ilan Pappé had to resign his position at Haifa University and move, and he teaches in England. Again, because there were threats on his life for his outspoken, you know, he's the one who wrote The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. He is one of the new historians that are really defying the myth of Israel that they have been taught as children. They grow up as historians, professors, and they look at the archives, and they look at the Israeli, and they started realizing the crime in 1948 and the multiple massacres that drove those refugees and ended up in the creation of the State of Israel. By the way, 80% of the population in Gaza are refugees that have been expelled from historic Palestine in 1948. And we have to take that into consideration. I mean, the level of their misery.
Yeah, I think it is important to point out that there are a number of important Israeli groups and organizations that protest their government's policy, that advocate for a just peace, for you know, responding to war crimes and enforcing human rights. And just as many peace and justice organizations and groups in the United States are attacked and marginalized, called unpatriotic, un-American, the same thing happens to those Israeli voices for peace. But they're there, and they're quite strong, and I think it's very important to recognize them, but also to point out that they're increasingly marginalized. I mean, you know, in my long time of studying state crime, that's always what happens, you know, because you're not talking about the government, you're talking about the state committing crimes, engaging in atrocities, and there are people that don't want to hear that. They don't want to hear about their own government committing these kinds of criminal acts, and they feel that because of nationalism and patriotism or the ties of religion or ethnicity, they have to support, right? My government, right or wrong. Well, no, to me, that's the wrong attitude. If your government is wrong, then you have to try to make it right. Yeah. You can't say my government right or wrong and cover up or you know, advocate what your government's doing when they're violating the law, particularly when they're engaged in such wholesale violations of international law and violations of human rights as is what's happening. And by the way, mentioning the International Criminal Court, I want to make clear the United States has not signed the Rome Statute. The United States is not a participant in the International Criminal Court because we say there's no way we would ever allow for the International Criminal Court to do anything about U.S. military actions. And it's almost like the United States, which helped to create international law. I mean, I want to point out that at the end of World War II, it was the United States and Great Britain that led the advance with the Atlantic Charter, that led to the UN Charter, and the modern basis for international law, except then we turn around and say, well, that doesn't apply to us. Right. International law applies to everybody else in the world.
Exception.
But somehow we're an exception, and because of our support of Israel, Israel is granted the same kind of exception from being held accountable under international law.
Right.
And the other problem with international law, therefore, is that the enforcement mechanisms are completely ineffectual, right? The international law is strong in the sense that it sets out a set of standards, right? Human rights standards and particular laws governing the actions of states. But at the same time, then, the enforcement mechanism is simply not there. So it's good to be able to say, well, that's a violation of human rights under international law, but then what are you going to do about it? And there is very little
But
to do about it.
they do care about their image, though. And I
Yes.
think the international image is really important.
And the freedom to travel.
That's right.
Because if they have been charged, if the Palestinians will go to the court and charge them with that crime, then they only can fly straight to the United States. They cannot be flying their leaderships, the ones who are responsible for these massacres now and before. They will not be able to fly into any other country.
Very important. I think that one of the things that has really jarred me is the discrepancy between the way the mainstream press is presenting this and talking to people who are on the ground and other viewpoints about what is really happening here. And the mainstream press's complete embrace of Israel. I mean, we had the story of the NBC reporter who was removed from Gaza when he witnessed the killing of the 4 kids,
On the
9
beach.
to 11 years old, reported on that. He was withdrawn. They were forced to send him back.
Yes.
But I think just yesterday, a Palestinian woman on MSNBC, a commentator, and I can't recall her name right now, she spoke out on the air about the imbalance in the presentations. And she was on Amy Goodman's show this morning, and she said that all her future appearances on MSNBC have been canceled.
Oh.
So there's retaliation. If you try to speak out and say, hey, what's the story? And Nora, I'm wondering, I don't know if you've had a chance to read a lot of the American papers since you've been here, and if you've been able to notice a difference between the way things that happen in Israel and in Palestine are reported here and in your home. Have you been able to do any of that?
Well, I haven't read newspapers, but I've seen that the way people here express their feelings or their opinions, that they go to protests holding the signs, and that's how they send their message, or they write about what they're feeling. In Palestine or Israel, what it's doing is that it's sending a wrong message to the world about Palestinians, and then in the end, that's not true, and it's just bombing and shooting on Palestinian lands.
Okay, so there's a real discrepancy between what I think the narrative that the American people are hearing through the press is so different from what is actually happening on the ground. It's very disappointing.
One more thing I'd like to add quickly. We're talking about the violence of the military, the Israeli military. We're not talking about the violence of the settlers against the people in the West Bank. That's a daily occurrence in every village, in every street. And I mean, something we witness on a daily basis when you are there, and they are protected by the Israeli army. They get away with murder, literally. And they're getting very emboldened because of the support they have from here and for the protection of their army.
One of the things I think that we have to, I don't know how much time we got left.
About 5 minutes left.
5 minutes. This is not an issue where American people can say, this is not my business, that's them, let them fight it out, because we're deeply implicated in this whole thing. Our government supports the Israeli military, we support their government, we protect them internationally all the time. The United States is deeply implicated in all this. And so we as citizens of this country have a responsibility to speak out.
Yes.
And that is what has not happened here. And I think it hasn't happened because American people don't know the situation, don't know the story. But here's an opportunity to speak out and say, not in our name, not in our name.
Thank you.
As with many issues, the larger historical context and the larger political context is not presented.
Yeah.
It's not discussed. I mean, that's one of the key failings of our mainstream media. They, it's all sound bites. It's all, you know, it's all acceptance of the governmental perspective and the conventional wisdom, and they don't do any independent research. They don't provide that historical and political context that is so necessary to understand what's really going on. And we see that with so many issues,
Oh, yeah.
not just
Yeah.
this particular issue, but any issue that has to do with U.S. foreign policy, I think, falls into that category.
Again, the hold of the Israeli lobby on Congress,
Yes.
on the media, on the president, on everything explains all this one-sided policy and the media bias against the truth, actually. They cover up all the crimes.
Right.
And another book that's very important that Paul Findlay, an ex-senator of Illinois, wrote called They Dared to Speak Out.
Yeah.
And that's the methods the lobby follows in actually blackmailing and threatening the Congress to vote their way in every Senate act or law.
All right, we just have a couple of minutes left. So as we're taping this program today, John Kerry's heading up to Ramallah. And so what would be the best outcome from your perspective in terms of Kerry's visit, even understanding the limitations of the
I
U.S.
think Israel
governmental
wants
position?
out. Israel wants an end because I think they're implicated in something they didn't expect the resistance in Gaza to hold steadfast like this. They thought, you know, if they hit them hard, cause enough casualties, civilians, and they will just, you know, surrender. Now, there has to be a face-saving way that he has to somehow engineer to get Israel out of this dilemma, because the Palestinians are standing steadfast, end of the blockade, release of those prisoners that you re-imprisoned after that. And now the Palestinians have an Israeli hostage, one soldier that they took, which probably will be a new prisoner exchange. There are at least 10 to 12,000 Palestinians in Israeli jails. Nobody speaks about those. They're not part of the demands of this deal. So I think ending the blockade and letting the Gaza people live as human beings is going to be a big achievement.
Okay. Well, we are out of time. Shadia, I want to thank you for providing that important perspective. Nora, glad to have you on the program. Good luck going back to 8th grade, right? Back in the West Bank. And Don, good to talk with you again. And I hope we've provided some perspective, as we say, all critical issues. This is one of the most critical issues, alternative perspectives. We certainly presented a very alternative perspective today on this particular situation.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for being here, and thank you for joining us. And we'll see you again on Critical Issues, Alternative Views.